faith and disbelief, the doubting Thomas. The use of the phrase the doubting Thomas has prevailed for anyone who questions the truth of what another person is saying. Thomas was one of the 12 disciples of Jesus Christ who questioned, despite the assurance of the other apostles, the resurrection of Christ, asking to become a witness of it himself. Of course, considering only the apostle Thomas as an unbeliever does him an injustice, as no one believed before the resurrection. The resurrected Christ appeared before him. Over the centuries, the word faith in the various languages was inextricably linked to God, so that it is understood that only those who believe in him manifest faith. During the era of the so-called Renaissance, a revolution was manifested in Europe against all, until then, on the ground of authority. During modernity, which began with the so-called Enlightenment, the revolution also extended against God, who initially was pushed from the foreground of history, and finally his non-existence was declared. In fact, belief in gods or God was interpreted as necessary in pre-scientific society, so people were completely unable to interpret natural phenomena. Indirectly, but clearly, the highly simplistic, if not naive, explanation of religious sentiment, which characterized all the peoples of the so-called pre-scientific era, leads to the misleading and highly erroneous impression that science has proved that there is no God. Perhaps this has been the biggest fraud in modern history, as proof of the non-existence of God is not possible. Thinking honestly, we must accept, regardless of our beliefs, that science is incompetent to decide on the matter. People, philosophers, and social reformers decided and continue to decide irresponsibly. Scientists decided and continue to decide with scientific right, quote-unquote. They are burdened with deceiving the public who admire them for their intelligence and are, as a rule, unable to distinguish between scientific knowledge and the personal opinion of a scientist, even a top scientist. Some have gone so far as to argue that scientific truth is secured by the majority opinion. Although no polls have been conducted, let us accept that the materialistic worldview has been accepted by the majority of scientists, indeed by the great majority. Woe betide us if we end up accepting as scientific truth the opinion of the majority, ignoring the basic principles of positive science, observation, experiment, and mathematical conclusion, based on the evidence from the experiments. Now, based on the foregoing, it's clearly but incorrectly concluded that belief does not characterize the deniers of the existence of God at all. This is the biggest and most widespread myth in modernity. All people are affected by faith. They stand out among those who accept that they also believe in others, who arrogantly claim that they only accept what is dictated by logic and the findings of science. But science decides on the nature and the biological part of man. On these there is no rivalry between believers in God and believers in the non-existence of God. The lurid 19th century argument that anatomists did not detect the soul, which according to believers in God of the Apocalypse frightfully differentiates man from other animals, even primates, has thankfully lost much of its force. Of course, there are still many people dealing not with the soul, but with the derivatives of the word of the Greek language, psychology, mental illness, psychotherapy, things like that. Man is not only a biological being, and its existence is not limited to the research of those that can be measured as physical, chemical, or biological quantities. Some deniers of God have lost sight of the emotional world, as they are unable to find units of measure for love and hate, self-sacrifice and the sacrifice of others, extremes of selfishness and selflessness. Common sense, term in complete abuse, empty of content. Who is she? What is common sense? And with this as a basis, Descartes Hellenized, proved, deluded by the scholastic Western theology with logical arguments, quote-unquote, that there is a God and a soul. Even today in the West, he's considered the founder of rationalism. Within 2 centuries, the West moved to the opposite, to denial. Then others with logical arguments proved that there is no God. During modernity, the course of logic, quote-unquote, was an introduction to the course of philosophy, which followed in the teaching. Simple conclusion: there are as many logics as there are beliefs and philosophies. And they all refer to the mental world of man. They differ essentially from scientific logic, which is taught not differently, but identically throughout the length and breadth of the earth. The course of the autonomous man during modernity led some philosophers to decide that man is an irrational being. The 20th century closed with intense interest in the philosophy of the absurd. And following the divine revelation, they are enabled to analyze human actions based on the virtues and passions that characterize the protagonists of history. Man was created by God to be rational, therefore responsible for his actions and omissions. It's not the product of random processes of nature, as those who deny our Creator decide with immeasurable intensity of faith. A horse, like the other animal forms, is or irrational. This extremely dangerous belief aims at granting amnesty for all crimes against humanity, in imitation of the Vatican's wretchedness, which offered a large number of pardons against a financial contribution. They used to pay for the absolution of their sins, and that's why Luther went against the Vatican, as we know, and started Protestantism. Now, in the denial of the existence of God, our passions excessively support us. It's difficult for us to proclaim that we expect a resurrection of the dead, since upon self-examination we find that we do not meet the criteria for entering the kingdom of God. So it's better for us that there is no God, to believe that there is no God, so we don't have to examine ourselves and change our way of life. So it's better for us that there is no God, and since leading scientists and thinkers assure us, they greatly strengthen this belief, which in fact has the mantle of man of the one freed form. Superstitions of the past based on correct logic and the findings of science. Freed from superstitions. But the existing soul within us, driven into non-existence with its maker, is starving. And since belief in God in Western societies is forbidden, in the name of common sense, quote-unquote, common reason, it seeks substitutes for belief, which are generously offered to it without being distributed by scientists, philosophers, intellectuals, social analysts, and politicians. Astrology, divination, witchcraft, Eastern mysticism, and even Satanism have flourished in the Western societies and are already bearing fruit. Man, liberated, quote-unquote, by God, has succumbed to a multitude of vices and passions. Having even been deprived of hope in God, he entrusts it to inner-worldly saviors, quote-unquote, who, passionate beings, sacrifice him instead of sacrificing themselves for him, like the God-man Jesus Christ. Christ is risen. This I've translated for you from a Greek article by Makarianis. Please leave your comments, and thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support, and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.